There is a nightmare that goes beyond anything the imagination typically conjures. It is not the monster in the darkness, or the fall that never ends, or the faceless threat that chases you through corridors that keep extending. Those nightmares end. You wake from them, gasping, heart pounding, and then the room comes into focus, and you understand that you are safe, that your body is yours, that you can move and speak and call out and be heard. The nightmare I am about to describe does not end when you open your eyes. It begins there. Imagine being completely awake, completely aware, your mind working at full capacity, thinking, observing, understanding, feeling every emotion with complete intensity. And imagine that your body has become a sealed room, that you cannot move a finger or turn your head or make a sound, that you cannot even blink in the rhythm of your own choosing, that the people around you believe you are gone, that the person who lived in this body has already left, while you are in fact present for every word they say, every decision they make, every plan they construct over what they believe is your empty shell. This is not a horror story I am inventing. This is a medical reality called locked-in syndrome. And today, I want to tell you about a woman named Clara who found herself inside it, and about what she did from there. Clara Whitfield was 40 years old and at the height of a career that had taken her 2 decades to build. She was an architect, not in the generic sense of someone who draws buildings, but in the specific, demanding sense of someone whose work had been written about in publications, had won awards, had changed the skylines of 3 cities. She had built her firm from a 2-person operation in a rented office into a company with 40 employees and a client list that included corporations, governments, and cultural institutions. She had done this through intelligence and discipline and an absolute refusal to cut corners. And the financial result of 20 years of that approach was a personal fortune that her accountants tracked in the 8 figures. She had married Richard 6 years earlier. He was handsome in the way that requires effort and resources to maintain, the kind of man who knew which suits communicated what, who understood the language of rooms and tables and which ones to be seen in. He had presented himself, when they met, as a developer in the early stages of a significant project, and in the early years of the marriage, this presentation was maintained with sufficient convincing detail that Clara had no reason to examine it too closely. She loved him. She was busy. She was running a company and winning commissions and doing the work she had organized her life around. And Richard was beside her at the events that required a partner and absent during the hours that required genuine presence. And she had told herself that this was simply the shape of a modern marriage between 2 ambitious people. She had been telling herself this for some time when the stroke happened. It was a Tuesday morning in March. She was in her office, reviewing drawings for a civic project that was 2 years in development. And then she was on the floor, and then she was not aware of anything for a period of time that she would never be able to reconstruct. What happened in her brainstem in those minutes was catastrophic and precise, a disruption to the specific neural pathways that govern voluntary muscle movement, while leaving intact the systems responsible for consciousness, thought, sensation, and awareness. The cruelest possible division, everything that makes a person present, and nothing that allows them to demonstrate it. She woke, if waking is the right word for returning to awareness when no external sign of that return is possible, in a hospital bed. She could see the ceiling. She could see, when her eyes moved in the only directions they still could, the walls and the window and the doorway. She could hear. She could feel the sheets, the IV line, the particular temperature of the room. She could think with complete coherence about what had happened and what it meant and what was going to happen next. She could not move. She could not speak. She could not swallow or breathe without the machinery that had been attached to her body while she was unconscious. She could not turn her head to see who entered the room until they came into her fixed field of vision. She could blink after a fashion, not in the fully controlled way of before, but enough. The eyes remained. They were the last outpost of a self that was entirely intact and entirely imprisoned. Richard was at the bedside when she first became aware of her surroundings. He was performing grief with the commitment of someone who has been practicing it. the bent posture, the lowered head, the hand that covered his face at intervals. He spoke to the nurses in the subdued tones of a man at the edge of what he could bear. She watched him, and she thought, in the clear and terrible silence of her locked room, that she had never seen him work this hard at anything. The neurologist came on the third day. He was not a bad doctor. He was a competent one, operating within the genuine difficulty of assessing consciousness in a patient who could not respond to verbal commands, and whose eye movements had not yet been systematically tested. He explained to Richard, with clinical precision and evident care, that the damage to Clara's brainstem was extensive, that the prognosis for meaningful recovery was poor, that the most likely outcome was a persistent vegetative state. He used the phrase quality of life. He discussed options. Clara heard every word. She wanted to scream. The word for what she wanted to do was scream, a full-bodied, lung-exhausting scream that would fill the room and stop the conversation and force everyone present to understand that she was there, that she was listening, that the person they were discussing was present and aware and needed them to stop talking about her as though she had already left. She had the scream inside her completely. She had no way to release it. Richard's face, when the doctor finished, was difficult to read from her fixed angle, but she could see enough. She could see the quality of attention he brought to the word vegetative and the phrase persistent, and the clinical language around the possibilities of life support decisions. She had known Richard for 6 years. She knew the particular stillness that came over him when he was calculating something. He thanked the doctor warmly. He asked careful, appropriate questions. He was, in that office, a portrait of a devastated husband, navigating an impossible situation with dignity. And she watched him and understood, in the cold, clear light of a mind that had nothing to do but think, that she had been wrong about what kind of man she had married. He moved quickly after that. The expensive medical team, the specialists, the neurologist with the international reputation, the rehabilitation consultants who had not yet been given enough time with Clara to assess her properly, was replaced within 2 weeks. Richard cited financial management, the long-term nature of the care required, the advice of a different doctor who had reviewed the case and confirmed the vegetative state diagnosis. Clara was moved home, to the bedroom they had shared, now reconfigured with the equipment required for her ongoing survival. The new nurse arrived on a Monday morning. Her name was Chloe, and Clara knew her face. The knowledge arrived the way devastating recognitions sometimes do, not as a gradual assembly of evidence, but as a single, complete, sickening understanding. She had seen this face before, in a photograph that she had not been meant to see, on a phone that Richard had left open by accident 18 months earlier, in an image that she had chosen at the time to interpret as a professional contact, a colleague, a client, because the alternative interpretation was one she was not yet ready to make. She was ready to make it now. She had nothing else to do. Chloe moved through the room with the proprietary ease of someone who has been waiting to occupy a space and is finally being allowed to do so. She adjusted Clara's IV with the efficient carelessness of someone performing a task rather than caring for a person. She spoke on her phone, in the room, in front of Clara, in the way you speak in front of furniture. And when Richard came into the room that evening and they kissed, standing at the foot of Clara's bed, it was with the comfortable familiarity of a couple in their own home, because that is what they believed it was. I want you to understand what Clara experienced in the weeks that followed, because it is important that you understand it completely. She was awake for most of each day. Her mind was clear. She could hear every conversation that took place within range of her unmoving ears, and in a room where 2 people believed they were entirely unobserved, the conversations were comprehensive. She heard them discuss the money, her accounts, her firm, the specific assets and what they were worth, and how the inheritance would be structured. She heard them discuss her, the inconvenience of her care, the specific tasks that Chloe complained about with the flat affect of someone who has no relationship to the person in the bed as a human being. She heard them discuss the timeline, the legal process for withdrawing life support, the forms that needed to be signed, the doctor who had already confirmed the diagnosis and would support the decision. She heard Richard laugh, once, at something Chloe said about the situation. It was a brief laugh, quickly suppressed, but she heard it, and she will hear it for the rest of her life. She tried everything she could think of. She concentrated every remaining capacity she had on moving something, a finger, a toe, the corner of her mouth. She tried to produce sound, any sound, through the immovable architecture of her throat. She tried to make her breathing change rhythm in a way that might be noticed. She understood, in the patient, exhausting way of someone with nothing but time to understand things, that none of this was working. Her eyes could move. That was what she had. That was the entire inventory of her available tools. She began to use them deliberately. When Richard was in the room, she tracked him. She held her gaze on him when he spoke. She moved her eyes in patterns that were not random. To the window, back to him, to the door, back to him, in deliberate repetition. Richard noticed once and said to Chloe that the eye movements were involuntary, a known feature of this type of brain injury, and went back to his phone. She watched him dismiss her, and she thought, in the locked room of herself, that this was not over, that she had time, that they, for all their planning, were making the fundamental error of underestimating her. Martha came in on the night shift. She was older, in her mid-60s, Clara estimated from what she could see. She sat in the chair in the corner, and she was quiet in the specific way of someone who is comfortable with their own company, who has learned through experience that silence is not empty. She brought a paperback book that she read through the early hours. She did not talk to Chloe beyond the necessary handover information. She had the careful, efficient movements of someone who has done physical work for a long time and knows how to be economical with effort. On the third night, Martha got up from her chair at around 2 a.m. to check the IV line. She was standing beside the bed, looking at the equipment, and Clara was looking at her. Martha glanced down, and their eyes met, and something changed in Martha's face, a quality of attention that was different from the professional attention of task completion. She looked at Clara for a moment. Then she said, quietly, into the room, "If you can understand me, blink twice." The instruction went through Clara like electricity. Not metaphorically, there was a physical response in her body to the possibility that was opening, a response she had no way to show except the one she had. She blinked twice. Slowly, deliberately, so there could be no question about whether it was intentional. Martha was very still for a moment. Then she pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat down. She said, "My husband was in the Navy. He taught me Morse code 40 years ago. I have not used it since he passed." She paused. "I think I still remember most of it. If I call out letters and you blink when I reach the right one, we can talk." She said, "If you are willing to try, blink twice." Clara blinked twice. What followed, over the next 6 months, was the most laborious and the most important work that Clara had ever done. They worked in the hours between 1 and 4 in the morning, when the house was quiet and Chloe and Richard were asleep, with Martha sitting beside the bed, calling out letters in quiet sequence, and Clara blinking at the right ones, and Martha writing them down in a notebook that she kept in her coat and brought home every morning. The progress was slow. In the first week, they established the rhythm, calibrated the pace, developed shortcuts for common words. By the second week, Clara was able to communicate in short phrases. By the fourth week, they were having conversations, limited, painstaking, each sentence taking many minutes, but real conversations, in which Clara's full intelligence and precision were present and operative. She told Martha who she was. She told her about the firm, about the assets, about what she had heard Richard and Chloe say in this room. She told her about the doctor's assessment and why she believed it was wrong, or being used as wrong. She told her about the photograph she had seen 18 months before, and what she now understood it to mean. Martha listened to all of it. She wrote down all of it. And then she said, in the careful way of someone who has decided to do something significant and is not making the decision lightly, "Tell me what you need." What Clara needed was her lawyers. The firm had represented her personal interests for 11 years, and the senior partner, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had built the firm's estate and asset practice, and who had, in Clara's assessment, the temperament of someone who did not frighten easily, was someone Clara trusted completely. She gave Martha the office number. She gave her specific language to use in the initial call, particular information that would confirm to Patricia that the communication was genuinely from Clara. Patricia came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon, presenting herself as a social worker, conducting a routine welfare check. Richard was present for part of the visit and was charming and cooperative and entirely unaware of what was actually happening when Patricia sat beside the bed and conducted what appeared to be a standard assessment. What was actually happening was Clara, with Martha's coaching and a system of blinks they had refined over weeks, confirming to her attorney that she was conscious, competent, and able to instruct counsel. Patricia left the house and immediately filed for an emergency protective order and initiated a complete freeze of Clara's personal accounts. She retained an independent neurologist of international reputation to review Clara's case. She contacted a detective she had worked with on previous fraud matters. The cameras were Martha's idea. She suggested them on a Thursday night, quietly, with the practical problem-solving of someone who understands that documentation is what transforms a conversation into evidence. Clara's firm had an account with a security company. She knew the contact name, she knew the authorization codes. Martha made the call. The installation was arranged for a Wednesday when Richard and Chloe had plans to be out of the house, plans that Clara had heard discussed in enough detail to know the timing and duration. The cameras were small and unremarkable and positioned to cover the angles of the room that mattered. What they recorded over the following 3 weeks would later be described by the detective handling the case as among the most comprehensive documentation of intent he had encountered in 20 years of work. Richard and Chloe were not cautious in that room. They believed they were alone with a person who was not present, and they spoke accordingly. About the timeline for the legal proceedings, about the specific accounts they planned to access first, about the details of what they called the transition, in a language that made its meaning clear in the context of everything that surrounded it. They recorded audio of Richard telling Chloe the date he had set for the notary appointment and what would happen after it. They recorded the exact conversation they would later have to hear again in front of a detective, in a room where their expressions would be very different than they were on the afternoon they first said those words. Martha never faltered. This is worth saying clearly. She was an older woman working a night shift job that paid modestly, who had discovered that the person in her care was conscious and being conspired against, and who had decided, without extended deliberation, that she was going to do something about it. She kept the notebook. She made the calls when she needed to. She maintained her ordinary demeanor through every day shift handover, through Richard's occasional appearances in the room at night when he couldn't sleep, through the accumulating pressure of knowing what was coming and not being able to show that she knew. She had been married to a Navy man for 30 years. She understood something about the importance of holding a position. The morning of the notary appointment arrived on a Thursday in October. Richard and Chloe were in the living room. She could not see them from the bed, but she could hear them. The pop of a champagne bottle, which arrived with the particular timing of people who have decided to celebrate something before it has technically been completed. She heard glasses. She heard the comfort of two people who believe the difficult part is behind them, and only the administrative formality remains. The doorbell rang at 11 o'clock. She heard Richard's footsteps in the hall, the specific rhythm of someone who expects to find a notary and is ready for this to be concluded. She heard the door open. She heard the voice of a man who was not a notary. The voice said, "Richard Calloway, I am Detective Frank Reardon with the Major Crimes Unit. I am here with officers who have a warrant for your arrest on charges including conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and criminal neglect of a dependent adult. I need you to step outside." The sound that followed was not a clean sound. It was the sound of a man whose entire constructed reality is collapsing in real time. And it was not composed, and it was not dignified, and it contained, somewhere in its chaos, the specific quality of someone who has understood, all at once, the full extent of what has happened to them. Patricia Holt was in the room with Clara within 20 minutes of the arrest. She sat in the chair beside the bed, and she spoke clearly and directly, the way she always had. She said, "It is done. The accounts are secured. The protective order is in place. The independent neurologist is arriving this afternoon. You are going to a rehabilitation facility tomorrow morning, one of the best in the country, and your care will be funded by your own assets, which are now in a trust that no one can access except in your interest." She paused. "You did this. You and Martha. I want you to know that." Clara blinked twice. The rehabilitation facility was nothing like the room where she had spent 6 months. It was staffed by people who understood what she was and what she needed, who spoke to her directly and developed with her, over months, through patience and technology, and the specialized expertise of people who have spent careers working with exactly this condition. Augmentative communication systems that went far beyond what was possible with blinks and Morse code. There was a device, there was software. There was, eventually, a synthesized voice that was not her voice, but was hers, that spoke the words she composed. The first thing she said with it, in a session with her speech therapist and Patricia Holt and Martha, who had driven 2 hours to be there, was this: "I heard everything they said about me, every word, and I want them to know that." They did know. The trial was thorough, and the evidence was comprehensive, and the recordings, played in court in a proceeding that Clara's attorneys had ensured would be documented in the fullest possible way, left no ambiguity about what had been planned and said and done. Richard received a sentence that his attorneys had, over the preceding months, worked extensively to reduce and had not reduced nearly enough. Chloe's sentence ran concurrently. The doctor who had confirmed the vegetative state diagnosis without adequate examination faced a separate proceeding before the medical licensing board. Clara's firm had continued operating during her absence under the management structure she had put in place years before for exactly this contingency, because she was the kind of person who planned for contingencies, who understood that institutions are more durable than the individuals who build them, when the individuals build them correctly. She returned to a role in the firm that she and her leadership team designed around her current capabilities, which were not what they had been and were more than Richard and Chloe had understood them to be, considerably more. Martha came to visit once a month, and they had conversations now that were not constrained by the rate of blinked letters in the dark. Clara had said in one of those conversations that she wanted to understand how Martha had known. Not the clinical question of how she had noticed the eye tracking. Clara understood the how of that. She meant the other question, why she had acted on it, why she had not told herself, as many people would have reasonably told themselves, that she might be wrong, that it was probably involuntary movement, that it was not her place. Martha had thought about this for a moment and then said, "Because I knew what it was like to be in a room where no one was listening." She did not elaborate, and Clara did not ask her to. Some answers are complete in the form they arrive in. I want to say something before I leave you with this story. They thought she was buried. They thought the person who had built the company and the fortune and the life was gone, and that what remained was a body to be managed and eventually released from the obligation of continuing. They thought the locked room was empty. They were wrong in the way that people are wrong when they confuse the silence of something with its absence. When they look at what they cannot see and conclude that nothing is there. When they are so certain of their own narrative that they do not check the eyes. She was in the eyes. She was entirely in the eyes, watching and thinking and waiting for 6 months, with the patience of someone who understands that the thing you have on your side is time, and that the people who believe they have already won are not spending their time the way you are spending yours. They had underestimated her when she could speak. They had underestimated her further when she could not. This was their mistake, and it was the same mistake, made twice, and it cost them everything. They thought they had buried her alive in her own body, but they forgot to close her eyes.